In the snowy mountains of Montana, a soldier came home to say goodbye. But what he found hidden beneath his parents' old cabin would change everything. A secret box buried under the floorboards, a letter written in fear, and proof that his parents weren't ordinary people. They were undercover agents fighting a human trafficking ring inside their own town. Now, with his loyal German shepherd by his side, Daniel must face the same darkness that took his parents' lives. As the storm rises, bullets fly, and faith is tested, he discovers that God's miracles often come through courage, not lightning. If you believe faith can still move mountains, don't scroll away. Hit subscribe, share, and comment Amen to help spread this story of hope, faith, and redemption. May the Lord bless and protect everyone watching. The wind swept down from the northern ridge, dry and biting, carrying with it the scent of pine and decay. Cedar Ridge, Montana, lay quiet under a pale afternoon sun that seemed too tired to warm anything. The leaves, brittle and rust-colored, scraped against the empty streets. Most houses were closed up tight, shutters drawn, waiting for winter's first heavy snow. On the far edge of town stood an old cabin made of weathered cedar logs, half buried in fallen needles and silence. That was the Hayes home, a place that once pulsed with laughter, radio music, and the smell of Margaret Hayes's cinnamon coffee. Daniel Hayes parked his dusty Ford truck by the porch, its tires crunching the gravel that hadn't been disturbed in months. He sat still for a moment, staring at the faded porch swing creaking in the cold wind. 35 years old, Daniel carried the stiffness of a man who had seen too much too young. His face was lean, his jaw sharp, and the shadow of a once full beard traced along his cheeks. His short brown hair was flecked with gray around the temples, not from age but from years spent in desert deployments, places where every sunrise demanded something from him. His green eyes, once bright with humor, now seemed to calculate everything around him like a soldier reading terrain. War had taught him to observe first, move second, and trust rarely. The passenger door clicked open, and a large German shepherd jumped out. Ranger. The 5-year-old dog landed lightly despite his size. His coat was a mix of sable brown and black, thick and glistening even in the dull light. Scars traced faint lines across his left flank, remnants of a past Daniel never spoke about, an IED training mishap during deployment. Ranger had been a working dog back then, trained for search and rescue. He moved now with that same silent precision, nose twitching, tail steady, eyes alert. "Easy, boy," Daniel murmured as Ranger padded up the porch steps and sniffed at the door. The key was cold metal in Daniel's gloved hand. He turned it slowly, and the lock resisted, stiff, as if time itself had sealed the house against intrusion. When the door finally opened, the smell of dust and something faintly metallic rolled out. Inside, the air was still. Sheets covered the furniture like ghosts frozen mid-dance. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting thin golden lines through the haze. Family photos still hung on the wall. Thomas and Margaret smiling in front of Yellowstone Park, a much younger Daniel in uniform beside them. He paused at that photo longer than he meant to. His father, Thomas Hayes, had been tall, broad-shouldered, with that calm, collected posture of a man who never raised his voice but always got things done. His mother, Margaret, had the soft kind of beauty that comforted everyone around her. Brown hair tied back, steady hazel eyes that hid little and forgave much. The world believed they'd died of illness within months of each other while Daniel was still stationed overseas. Daniel didn't cry. He never had. Not when his best friend was hit by mortar fire. Not when the folded flag came back from overseas for another soldier's widow. Grief, for him, had always been like a locked box, but now, standing in the half-light of his parents' empty house, something inside that box began to hum. Ranger moved first, his nose pressed to the wooden floor near the old dining table. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Daniel crouched, running his hand along the boards. One plank felt loose, barely perceptible to the eye, but enough for a soldier's instincts to catch. He fetched a small crowbar from his truck and returned, prying the board free with a careful twist. Beneath it lay a metal lockbox coated in dust and spiderwebs. The lock had already been forced once, scratched and bent. Daniel frowned. Someone had found this before him, or tried to. Using a small knife, he picked what was left of the mechanism and lifted the lid. Inside were folders, sealed plastic bags, and an old flash drive. On top of everything else lay a folded letter, written in his father's familiar, square handwriting. He sat back on his heels and read aloud in a whisper. "If you're reading this, Danny, something went wrong. We were never who you thought we were. The people we worked for, they're not who they claim to be either. Watch the man in City Hall. He smiles too easily." Daniel's breath caught. Beneath the letter were photographs, grainy surveillance shots of vans, children's faces blurred by motion, and a map of Cedar Ridge's outer roads with red X's marking locations through the forest. It wasn't random. It was a pattern. And in one envelope, a faded badge. Federal Investigations Division, Covert Task Group. His father's name was printed beneath it. He exhaled slowly, the pieces shifting like cold metal gears in his head. His parents hadn't been ordinary employees for a public utility company, as he'd always believed. They had been undercover agents, investigating something dangerous enough to cost them their lives. Ranger barked sharply, spinning toward the back door. The sound startled Daniel out of his thoughts. The latch was slightly cracked. The wood splintered, fresh, not months old. He crouched and examined it. Small scrape marks, likely from a crowbar. Someone else had been here recently. The air outside was colder now, and the tree line beyond the yard swayed in the wind like a restless crowd. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and scanned the floor. Faint mud prints crossed from the door to the kitchen, too light to belong to him. Someone had entered after the official cleanup. He checked the box again. Everything seemed in place, but maybe not everything had been there to begin with. As the sun sank behind the ridge, long shadows swallowed the room. Daniel packed the box into his duffel and sat in the armchair his father used to occupy every evening, newspaper in hand, whiskey glass on the table. "You were chasing something," he whispered, "and it chased you back." Ranger lay beside his boots, ears flicking at every creak. Daniel rubbed the dog's head absently. His heartbeat had steadied now, the soldier's calm returning like muscle memory. He could call the sheriff, file a report, hand over the evidence, but he didn't trust the local department. Too many old alliances, too many smiles like the one his father had warned about. He stood and looked around one last time. The peeling wallpaper, the faint outline of his mother's favorite clock on the wall, the smell of cinnamon that still lingered faintly, impossibly, after all this time. "We'll find out what happened," he said quietly. Ranger lifted his head as if understanding. Outside, the wind carried the first flurries of snow, swirling pale against the dark sky. Daniel locked the door behind him, feeling the weight of both memory and duty settle in his chest. The mission his parents had started wasn't over. It had only been waiting for him to come home. By dawn, The calm over Cedar Ridge had vanished. A hard wind screamed down from the mountain pass, carrying with it shards of frozen rain that pinged off rooftops and howled through the narrow streets. The weather forecast had warned of a storm, but Montana's storms always came earlier and angrier than anyone expected. Daniel stood by the kitchen window of his parents' cabin, watching hail slam against the glass like 1,000 small fists. Ranger sat at his feet, tail curled, eyes locked on the door, his ears twitching with every distant crack of thunder. The storm outside felt almost deliberate, nature's cover for something dark about to be unearthed. Daniel had barely slept. The box he'd found under the floorboard sat open on the table, and the flash drive blinked faintly in his laptop. A single folder appeared. Surveillance Video A17. He clicked it. The footage was grainy, time-stamped from 6 months earlier. His father's voice could be heard faintly in the background, whispering to someone. His mother, maybe. The camera focused on a warehouse at the town's edge, marked with a faded logo, Blue Valley Transport Co. Trucks moved in and out at odd hours, their headlights cutting through fog. Then, in one frame, the camera jerked. A man in a dark coat stepped into view. Even blurred, the man's build and walk had a polished confidence. The same face Daniel remembered from campaign posters. The town's mayor, Richard Cole. Before he could think further, Ranger's growl rose again. The dog had pushed himself halfway under the counter, pawing at something. Daniel crouched and saw the edge of another metal box, smaller than the first. He pried it loose. Inside lay a military-grade encrypted radio, its battery still intact, and a notepad filled with handwritten license plates, each one marked with a date beside the annual Cedar Ridge Harvest Fair. The handwriting was his mother's. Daniel's pulse quickened. Each year, children had gone missing during that very week, and those cases had quietly disappeared from the sheriff's database. He needed help, someone who wasn't afraid to dig where the law refused. There was only one person who fit that description. By noon, the hail had turned to a cold drizzle. Daniel drove his pickup through the slick, gray streets toward a small cabin just off Mill Creek Road. The mailbox still read, Brooks. He parked, stepped out, and knocked on the door. After a pause, it opened to reveal Helen Brooks, a woman in her early 60s, broad-shouldered, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face bore the marks of someone who had spent decades under sun and authority. Firm jaw, sharp blue eyes, and faint lines of suspicion etched between her brows. She wore a flannel shirt over a faded sheriff's jacket, the badge long removed, but the weight of leadership still visible in her posture. Helen had once been Cedar Ridge's police chief until she'd retired, or been forced out, depending on who you asked. Daniel Hayes, she said, voice roughened by years of cigarettes and disappointment. Didn't expect to see you back. Didn't expect to come back, he replied. Can I come in? Her cabin smelled of gun oil and coffee. On the walls hung photos of local parades, hunting trophies, and one framed commendation from the state governor dated 10 years ago. Ranger shook off rain near the doorway, earning a soft grin from Helen. Still got your dad's dog sense, she muttered. He always trusted that nose more than his radio. Daniel placed the folder of papers and the flash drive on her table. Helen slipped on her reading glasses, her expression hardening as she scanned the material. Thomas and Margaret. Damn it, I knew they were looking into this. The mayor's pet project, that transport company. I flagged it years ago when a delivery manifest didn't add up. Next thing I knew, the case was pulled off my desk, labeled administrative error. Then I got my early retirement letter. "So you think Cole's behind this?" Daniel asked. Helen leaned back, arms crossed. "Cole's not stupid. He's connected to donors, the state board, hell, maybe higher. But the timing, every missing child report matched a night those trucks rolled through. Your folks were building a timeline. Looks like they got close." They spent hours piecing the clues together. License plates, dates, old police logs Helen had copied before she left office. Each lead pointed to one location. Warehouse A17, a storage unit on the edge of the industrial zone, tucked near the tree line and abandoned mills. It was listed under Blue Valley Transport, but hadn't filed a tax record in years. Helen reached for a worn map and circled the spot. "There's your nerve center," she said. "If your parents went missing after this, that's where it started. But you can't go in blind. Cole's got private security on payroll, ex-state troopers mostly. They patrol at night. You'll need eyes before you act." "I don't plan to act yet," Daniel lied. Ranger, resting near the window, lifted his head as thunder rolled again. As evening fell, Daniel left Helen's cabin with a copy of her old files and a promise she'd keep digging. The rain had turned to sleet, slicking the windshield as he drove toward the outskirts of town. He parked near a cluster of pines overlooking the distant warehouse. Through binoculars, he could see dim floodlights and the faint silhouette of a guard pacing near the entrance. Another man exited moments later. Liam Porter, Cole's personal aide, a short man in a black trench coat who often handled city contracts. Daniel recognized him instantly. Porter's presence there wasn't coincidence, it was confirmation. Ranger whined softly beside him. "Yeah," Daniel whispered. They were right. The storm broke again, wind hammering the truck roof as Daniel watched the warehouse door close and the lights fade. Somewhere beneath that roof lay the answers to what had happened to his parents, and to the children Cedar Ridge had chosen to forget. The next morning broke gray and brittle, the air heavy with mist that clung to the pine branches like cobwebs. Daniel sat in his truck outside the local diner, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business except the ones that mattered most. Across the street, the town square was buzzing with people setting up for the annual harvest market. Banners fluttered, laughter carried faintly in the cold air. But to Daniel, every cheerful face was another mask hiding something darker. Ranger sat alert in the passenger seat, ears pricked, watching the crowd with the quiet focus of a trained soldier. Daniel's contact arrived right on time. Olivia Carter, 33, was hard to miss. Shoulder-length auburn hair tucked into a gray beanie, sharp brown eyes behind square glasses, and a trench coat several sizes too big for her small frame. She was a journalist for the Cedar Ridge Gazette, one of the few local reporters who hadn't been bought off or intimidated. Her reputation was that of a stubborn truth seeker. She'd once exposed a county funding scam that nearly got her fired. The town's elite hated her for it. Daniel respected her for the same reason. Olivia climbed into the passenger seat, glancing once at Ranger before settling in. "You weren't kidding about the dog," she said. "He looks like he could chew through a car door." "Only if I tell him to," Daniel replied. She grinned. "Good, because we're going to need all the teeth we can get." Daniel laid out the plan. They would create noise, a distraction. Olivia would publish an article hinting at new evidence tying Blue Valley Transport to missing shipments of medical supplies. It wasn't the real target, but it would be enough to draw attention from the warehouse while Daniel slipped in to find proof of something much worse. By afternoon, Olivia's post went live online. Within hours, social media accounts from nearby counties began sharing it. That evening, Daniel drove Ranger to the industrial edge of Cedar Ridge, where the warehouses stood silent under the flickering streetlights. He parked 2 blocks away from Warehouse A17, the place his father's notes had circled in red. Ranger jumped out, tail low, nose already twitching in the cold air. They moved in silence along the fence line. Daniel scanned the perimeter through night vision binoculars. 2 guards paced near the front gate, flashlights slicing through the fog. One was tall, muscular, early 40s, wearing a leather jacket and baseball cap pulled low. The other was thinner, bearded, his breath visible in the freezing air. Daniel recognized the look. Men hired not for loyalty but silence. He crouched near a drainage pipe, unscrewing the cover. "Go," he whispered. Ranger slipped in first, belly low, paws silent against the damp concrete. Daniel followed, emerging inside the fenced yard. The warehouse loomed ahead, its metal siding streaked with rust and the faint sound of humming generators coming from within. Moving between shadows, Daniel reached the line of refrigerated trucks parked by the loading dock. One had its back doors slightly ajar. Inside, rows of metal cages sat stacked, empty but stained with something darker than dirt. He placed a GPS tracker under the rear bumper, his breath slow, controlled. Then Ranger froze, nose lifted toward a stack of crates nearby. The dog barked once, sharply. Daniel hurried over and pried open one crate. It was filled with small vials labeled ketoprine hydrochloride, a potent sedative used in animal control and occasionally human trafficking operations. The serial code on the side matched the numbers in his father's files. His pulse quickened. They were on the right trail. Inside the warehouse, Daniel found a side door unlocked. The corridor was narrow, dimly lit by a single bulb swinging from the ceiling. Ranger padded quietly beside him. A faint metallic scent filled the air, like old blood and disinfectant. At the end of the hall, a steel door stood slightly ajar. Daniel pushed it open, revealing a temporary holding room, rusted folding chairs, shackles bolted to the wall, and a bucket of discarded zip ties. A ledger sat open on a desk, names written in code, 3-letter abbreviations and numbers beside each. His stomach tightened. Then, on the floor near the desk, something glinted. Daniel knelt and picked up a security pass. Black plastic, engraved faintly with the seal of Cedar Ridge City Hall. It was confirmation. Someone inside the government wasn't just turning a blind eye. They were orchestrating it. A noise snapped through the silence. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Daniel killed the flashlight and motioned Ranger down. Through the crack in the door, a man entered the hall, tall, in a heavy coat, his silhouette briefly illuminated by a flickering light. Daniel lifted his small hidden camera, zoomed in, and froze. It was Mayor Richard Cole himself. Cole removed his gloves, walked to the desk, and made a call on his phone. "Yes," his voice echoed faintly. "The next shipment leaves tomorrow night. Same route. No delays." Then he turned and exited through the side door. Daniel waited a full minute before exhaling. He recorded everything, the voice, the timestamp, the video. As he and Ranger slipped out into the freezing night, the storm clouds rolled in again, lightning flaring behind the ridge. Tomorrow night, the trucks would move. Tomorrow night, they'd make their play. The night fell under a curtain of white. Snow came earlier than expected, fierce and relentless, swirling across the mountain roads like ghosts chasing their own tails. The headlights of Daniel's truck cut narrow tunnels through the storm as he followed the faint red taillights of the refrigerated truck climbing ahead. Ranger sat rigid in the passenger seat, fur bristled, his nose pressed to the window. The windshield wipers struggled to keep pace with the snow. Every mile deeper into the woods, the more Daniel felt the air thicken, not just with cold, but with danger. The GPS tracker he'd planted blinked steady on his dashboard. The truck was heading toward the abandoned North Point Mill, a sprawling complex from the logging era now left to rot among the trees. Daniel's father's files had mentioned the site once, scribbled beside the words, sub-level facility. Now, it seemed the nightmare was real. Daniel parked 2 ridges away and killed the engine. The only sounds were the wind's shriek and Ranger's low growl. "Stay close," he whispered, pulling his coat tighter. He trudged through knee-deep snow, every crunch beneath his boots swallowed by the howling wind. The mill loomed ahead, massive broken windows glowing faintly from within. At the loading bay, the truck stopped. Men climbed out, 3 of them, armed, bundled in dark parkas. The tallest among them, Mason Briggs, was easy to recognize from Helen's files. A former deputy sheriff in a nearby county, he'd been fired for brutality, but quickly reappeared as a security contractor. His face was sharp and gaunt, the kind of face that looked permanently angry. His beard was flecked with gray, and his eyes were small and cold. The eyes of a man who enjoyed being feared. Briggs barked orders, directing the others to unload heavy crates toward a hatch in the ground. Daniel filmed the scene through his small camera lens, breath fogging the glass. He whispered coordinates into his radio. "Helen, it's Daniel. Found them. Sending you location now." Static crackled. Then Helen's voice came through, calm but firm. "Copy that. Units are rolling. ETA 20 minutes. Keep your head down, soldier." Inside the mill, Daniel and Ranger slipped along the shadows of broken machinery. The air was colder here, unnaturally cold. A vent from below released thin white vapor. Ranger sniffed, whining softly. Daniel pried open a rusted door and saw a stairway descending into the dark. The steps creaked underfoot as they went down, light fading until only the faint beam of his flashlight guided them. The basement opened into a concrete chamber, a makeshift freezer facility. Rows of cages lined the walls, most empty, but a few held terrified children wrapped in blankets, eyes wide and hollow. Daniel's heart clenched. Among them was a boy clutching a toy car, the same boy from one of his mother's surveillance photos. "It's okay," Daniel whispered, kneeling. "I'm getting you out." He used his knife to pry the locks open one by one. Ranger stood guard, growling whenever footsteps echoed above. Suddenly, gunfire shattered the air, short, hard bursts. The sound came from the upper level. Helen's team had arrived. Over the comms, her voice rang steady, issuing commands. "Push them to the north exit. Keep your cams live." The storm outside amplified the chaos, howling through broken rafters. Daniel led the children up the stairway, Ranger circling to block the rear. A man appeared at the top of the steps, Briggs again, rifle raised. Daniel dove forward, slamming his shoulder into the man's legs. The gun skittered across the floor. Briggs cursed and swung a heavy fist, catching Daniel's jaw. Pain flashed white. But Daniel, trained by years of close combat, countered with a hard strike to the throat. Briggs fell, gasping. Ranger lunged, teeth flashing, pinning the man down until his weapon was out of reach. Helen burst in seconds later, snow caked in her gray hair, body armor over her parka. "You picked a hell of a night," she said, breath steaming. Daniel nodded toward the children huddled near the door. "We've got them, but there's more evidence below. Drugs, manifests, everything." Helen activated her body cam, broadcasting the live feed through a secure line she'd prepped earlier. Already rolling to the county office and Olivia's channel, she said. If Cole's got friends watching, they'll see this before he can bury it. As the team escorted the children outside, Daniel stayed behind just long enough to retrieve the ledger and a few vials marked with serial numbers. Through the static of the radio came a new voice, smooth, commanding, unmistakable. Richard Cole. Briggs, the voice snapped. You handle this or I'll find someone who will. Nothing leaves that site. Erase it all. Daniel froze. He hit the record button on his transmitter, capturing every word. Ranger's ears flattened. The dog could sense the tension even through the storm. Outside, red and blue lights flashed through the blizzard. Helen's team fought to load the children into heated vehicles. Snow whipped across their faces, melting against the strobe of emergency lights. As the mill burned behind them, ignited by the fleeing guards in a desperate attempt to destroy evidence, Daniel looked back one last time. Flames licked through the snow, painting the night in orange and white. The truth was out now. Cole's voice was proof enough. Daniel knelt beside Ranger, scratching his fur. We did it, boy, he said quietly. But this isn't over. The dog leaned into his hand, eyes steady, as sirens wailed across the mountain. Morning arrived quietly, as if the storm itself had burned out with the night's violence. The town of Cedar Ridge lay buried under a clean sheet of snow, soft and deceptive, covering the scars of what had happened only hours before. Daniel stood on the porch of the Hayes cabin, a cup of black coffee steaming in his hands, eyes scanning the horizon. The same mountains that once looked serene now seemed like silent witnesses to too many secrets. Ranger lay nearby, nose buried in the snow, tail flicking lazily, though his ears stayed alert to every sound from the woods. The town was no longer the same. The rescue footage that Helen had streamed was everywhere, on local news, social media, and television. The faces of terrified children, the burning warehouse, and above all, the unmistakable voice of Mayor Richard Cole barking orders through the radio had ignited outrage far beyond Montana. Within hours, federal agents descended upon Cedar Ridge. Daniel watched from his truck as black SUVs rolled up to City Hall. The agents moved with precision. Bulletproof vests, clipped radios, mirrored sunglasses reflecting the stunned faces of townspeople gathering along Main Street. Mayor Cole emerged in a tailored gray coat, his once confident posture now slouched under the weight of exposure. His hair, perfectly combed in every public appearance before, hung disheveled, streaks of sweat visible on his temples despite the cold. His eyes darted like a trapped animal's when the lead agent, a woman with the calm authority of someone used to ending empires, read him his rights. Her name tag read, Agent Marissa Dean, early 40s, sharp-featured, her dark skin glowing against the snowlight. Her voice was steady, professional, but her eyes betrayed disgust as she handcuffed him. Cole's attempt to speak, to explain, to charm, died under the weight of cameras flashing like gunfire. Helen stood nearby, wrapped in her thick sheriff's jacket, face unreadable. She'd seen men like Cole before, charming, connected, untouchable, until someone finally drew the line. Took long enough, she muttered, then turned to Daniel. You did what your parents couldn't finish. Daniel nodded, jaw tightening. They did the hard part. I just followed the trail. By noon, the entire town buzzed with disbelief. Local businesses shut down, church bells tolled for the rescued children, and the mayor's mansion was sealed off for investigation. Olivia Carter stood outside the press tent, notebook in hand, hair tousled by the cold wind. She caught Daniel's eye and approached with a weary smile. You know, half the country's calling you a hero, she said. The other half's wondering how deep this thing goes. Daniel shrugged. Heroes are the ones we pulled out of that basement. Olivia scribbled something, then looked up. What are you going to do now? He didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted toward the snowy ridgeline beyond. The town, toward the past that wouldn't quite let go. That evening, Daniel returned to the cabin. The silence inside felt different now, less haunted, more sacred. He placed the rescued ledger, the video drive, and the radio on the table, then reached for the letter he had found half-finished days ago. The paper was creased and faintly yellowed, the handwriting steady but hurried. If you're reading this, son, something went wrong. We've uncovered something bigger than the town, bigger than us. But you have what it takes. Don't let fear or anger drive you. Let compassion guide you. If you can't save us, save them. The last line hit harder than he expected. Daniel folded the letter carefully and set it beside a framed photo of his parents smiling in front of the cabin many winters ago. He lit a candle, the flame trembling slightly from a draft, and watched as its glow warmed the glass. Ranger padded over, resting his head on Daniel's knee. The dog had seen too much, fought too long beside him. You're not done yet either, are you? Daniel murmured. Ranger's tail thumped once in answer. In the following weeks, the town began to heal. Helen organized volunteers to support the rescued children. Olivia used her platform to publish a full exposé, naming every official, every corrupt deputy, every company tied to Cole's shadow network. Donations began pouring in from across the country. Daniel, with funds from the seized assets, rebuilt the Hayes property into the Hayes Foundation, a small but growing refuge for missing and exploited children. He kept the original sign of the family name nailed to the gate. The letters faded, but proud. Ranger's role changed, too. With training from a rehabilitation specialist named Ellen Ward, a gentle woman in her 50s with silver hair and a soft voice that could calm even the most frightened child, Ranger learned to become a therapy dog. Ellen had spent decades working with trauma victims, her quiet strength born from her own loss, a son who never came home from the Gulf War. She believed healing started with trust, and Ranger, loyal and patient, became her perfect partner. Together, they worked with the children who had been rescued that night, helping them find comfort in a world that had betrayed them. On one snowy evening, Daniel stood outside the cabin, now lit from within by laughter. The scent of hot cocoa drifted out through the door as Ellen read to the children by the fire, and Ranger lay curled at their feet. Daniel looked up at the night sky, the stars sharp and cold. He whispered, "It's done, Dad. Mom, we finished it." The candle on the table flickered through the window, its light steady now, unwavering. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive in flashes of light from the heavens. Sometimes, they walk beside us on four paws, in the form of loyalty, courage, and love. Daniel didn't find gold, fame, or revenge. He found something far greater: faith. Faith that even in a broken world, goodness still rises. Faith that God never leaves his children, even when the storm is darkest. As Daniel lit that candle beneath his parents' photograph, it wasn't just for them. It was for every lost soul, every missing child, every person who's ever felt abandoned by hope. Because maybe God's greatest miracles aren't the ones that change the world in a second, but the quiet ones that change a heart forever. And perhaps, like Daniel, each of us is called to carry forward a piece of that light, to protect, to love, to forgive, and to keep believing when everything seems impossible. If this story touched your heart, take a moment right now to leave a comment sharing your thoughts or a prayer for the children still searching for home. Click subscribe so you don't miss the next story of hope and faith. Share this video, because your share might be the reason someone rediscovers their faith tonight. May God bless you, protect your home, and fill your heart with peace, just as He guided Daniel and Ranger through the storm.